Attribute number 2, beyond just the size of your business, is called the Switzerland structure. So before I tell you a little bit about this guy, I'll just define the Switzerland structure as an attribute. So the Switzerland structure gets its name from the country of Switzerland. Kind of a weird country. There's this tiny, if you look at a map, this tiny little country in the middle of Europe. Yet they didn't really join any of what was going on in Europe last century, right? So they didn't join either of the 2 world wars. They didn't join the United Nations until they had a countrywide referendum on the topic. Imagine in Canada us having like a countrywide referendum. Like, of course we're going to join the UN, but they didn't want to join until they had a countrywide referendum. They don't use the euro currency to this day. They didn't send troops to Iraq. I mean, they just have this obsession with remaining independent. They don't want to cozy up to any geopolitical faction. They are independent. And I want you to remember that story when you think about your company, because the most valuable businesses are ones that are independent of any one customer, employee, or supplier. That's the trifecta. That's 3 legs of the stool. You've got to make sure your business is not dependent on a key employee, supplier, or customer. Rick Day learned that the hard way. So Rick Day, based in California, he was running a telephony business, a telecom business. So they installed telephone systems in small companies, small, medium-sized companies. And on the outside, Rick's business was a success, right? $26 million in revenue, 100 employees, kind of pillar of the community. You would have looked at Rick and said, wow, that is an amazing business, right? What you didn't know was that Rick was becoming, over time, much more dependent on a single supplier. He was getting further and further into bed with Avaya. Avaya, the telephone company, they compete with Cisco, some of the other big telephone companies. And the deeper he got into Avaya, the more spiffs they gave him. More, longer to pay, went from 60 to 90 days, deeper the discounts and so forth. And so he got more and more in bed with this one supplier, to the point where by the time he went to sell the company, 90% of his supply was coming from Avaya. Well, when he went to sell the company, the acquirers walked in the door and said, well, what happens if Avaya leaves? What happens if Avaya changes its business strategy and hires salespeople instead of using VARs, value-added resellers, distribution channel? What happens if Avaya goes bankrupt? What happened? All these questions about Avaya. So to the point where when he went to sell his company, again, $26 million in revenue, he sold it for 4 times EBITDA. Now, I've just showed you that a $26 million company should be getting north of 5, and he sold it for 4. But that's not the whole story. When you actually get underneath the deal terms of the 4, it wasn't as pretty. 40% was paid up front. 40% was paid in a 3-year note, guaranteed, but a 3-year note, so he had to wait for his money. And then 20% was in an earnout. An earnout, obviously, is something that's not, they're not required to pay. You have to hit goals in the future to get your earnout. So most would argue that he didn't sell it for 4 times. He actually sold it for 80% of 4 times, just a little hair over 3 times, for a $26 million business. Again, the reason it was discounted relative to other businesses of that size is because he was too deeply dependent on Avaya. So the question again for you is, how do you reduce your reliance on key employee? We're going to workshop that in a minute. How do you reduce your reliance on a key employee and a key supplier? So customers, employees, suppliers. Customers, by the way, general rule of thumb is 15%, 1-5. What you want to do is make sure that you have nobody on your client list that's representing more than 15% of your revenue. It's a bit of an arbitrary number. It could be 20%, but that's the kind of number where there'd be a little bit of a red flag saying, hey, this customer seems pretty big relative to the rest of your business.